Hello, I'm Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. In This Week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network. In 1939, on the 17th of December, the Admiral Graf Spee is scuttled. On the 18th of December, the Battle of the Heligoland Bight takes place off the coast of Denmark. The Battle of Kunlun Pass begins in the Sino-Japanese War. On the 19th of December, the Anglo-French Supreme War Council decides to help Finland, and on the 21st of December, the Soviets halt major operations in Finland. In 1940, on the 16th of December, the German city of Mannheim is bombed. On the 17th of December, President Roosevelt tells a press conference that supplying arms to Britain is the best defense of the United States. On the 18th of December, Hitler issues the directive for Operation Barbarossa, and on the 20th of December, Liverpool is bombed. In 1941, on the 16th of December, the Battle of Gurun ends in Japanese victory. The Battle of Borneo begins. Axis forces begin to fall back to Elegela, and Hitler prohibits any retreat around Moscow. On the 17th of December, the First Battle of Sirte takes place in Libya. Japanese forces invade Penang Island, and Husband Kimmel is relieved of command of the US Pacific Fleet. He is replaced by Chester Nimitz. On the 18th of December, Japanese troops land on Hong Kong Island. On the 19th of December, the Indian 4th Division captures Derna in Libya. Decima Flotilla MES divers attack Royal Navy battleships in Alexandria. Hitler relieves Walter von Brauchitsch as Commander-in-Chief of the German Army and takes personal command. And on the 20th of December, Joseph Goebbels announces a winter clothing collection drive for the Eastern Front. In 1942, on the 17th of December, the Volga River freezes to allow Soviet forces in Stalingrad to be resupplied. On the 18th of December, Mussolini sends Galeazzo Ciano to urge Hitler to seek a separate peace with Moscow. In 1943, on the 15th of December, the New Britain campaign begins. On the 17th of September, America's Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 is repealed. The Battle of San Pietro in Fine in Italy ends in Allied victory, and on the 20th of December, the Battle of Ortona begins. In 1944, on the 15th of December, the 7th Army captures Riedseltz, Salmbach and Lauterbourg in eastern France. On the 16th of December, the Battle of the Bulge begins. The Battle of Mindoro ends in victory for the US and Filipino forces. Allied troops enter Faenza and cross the Senio River in Italy. On the 18th of December, British troops in Greece begin an offensive against left-wing Hellas rebels. On the 20th of December, the siege of Bastogne begins, and on the 21st of December, the Battle of Ormoc Bay ends in US victory. In 1945, on the 17th of December, Japanese women are granted the right to vote, and on the 21st of December, General Patton dies in Germany. Well, there you are. We've gone through basically the second week of December every year from 1940 to 939 to 1945. And so we got some really big dates. Now we're going to be focusing on two dates. Before we start, I want to bring in the co-host of this event. This is a good friend of ours, of everybody. It's Dr. Joe Quinn. How you doing, Joe? So you're back in Britain now. You were in Germany last week, weren't you?
Yes, I was in Berlin last week. Yeah. I thought about originally we discussed this about making a humorous introduction, from the heart of the former empire and all that. But given my experiences in Berlin, I found that there was very little to joke about. It is a city that I feel, having been there, not been there before, been there for the first time, it's a city very much scarred and still very much living in the shadow.
Well, that's interesting. You see, that's an interesting perspective. You did go to two rather somber museums when you were there. It's difficult to escape it if you go to, museums about the mass murder of Jews.
True. But I have to say that the museum, with all due respect to Holocaust memory, I have to say that the museum of basically the Topography of Terror Museum, which was located at the old SS headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse, was a far more affecting experience than the Museum of the Murdered Jews of Europe, in spite of the subject matter, for reasons that I explained last week. I think it was more to do with the fact that I'm a very spiritual person, and there was a very heavy feeling at the Topography of Terror Museum, because clearly quite a lot of people were tortured and killed at that site.
Yeah, well, that's not
great. Yeah, great evil took place there, and you can feel it there.
Yeah, that's not a great experience. It's fascinating. When I first went there 30 years ago, not long after and the reconstruction had started, and I thought, actually, the truth of the matter is, I thought Berlin was completely destroyed. I mean, completely flattened. I mean, there was basically nothing left, and I felt that all that was gone. It had all been erased. I thought the whole history of the Second War actually effectively had been erased. The only legacy of it, I thought, was the Reichstag, which had been beautifully reconstructed with the museum. And I went there, and you can walk down, and I recommend anybody. It's amazing because it starts off with the Reichstag as a democratic body, and then in the 1930s, I mean, it's just Nazis, and it's an amazing story. And I thought that was the only legacy. And I felt when I went there more than 30 years ago, I thought, surely there should be more about this period of German history. In the painful or not, even if there's a ruin left, maybe a ruin would be left, but it's all been deleted. And I thought that actually that Berlin had completely forgotten it. If you went there, it's completely forgotten. So I'm impressed by what you were saying. You felt it, but I didn't at all, and I was sensitive to all this. And as I mentioned last week, I think something about Berlin, which is it's curious and it's strange. Because it's like a huge part. It's amnesia. It's a huge part of the history went, and they've got these museums which have a very big effect on you. But of course, there's a story of Germany before, and there's a story afterwards. And maybe I don't know. Anyway, Joe, let's move on and let's talk our topics. I'm really going to focus on 43, 44 because a lot of the events in 39, 40, 41, and 42 we dealt with in obviously the start of the war. 1940, the Blitz in Britain, the bombing and the campaign, and then 41, specific really, and 41, 42, North Africa. Now 43 is compare and contrast. I'm going to start with 43. I'm going to have some talking points here. So Italy, the winter of 1943 really was the climax of the whole Italian campaign, even though obviously the Casino battle was enormous, and that was in May. And the final campaign in Italy in April 1945 was as big as anything, bigger than anything ever had taken place. But in many respects, this was the climax of the Italian, when Italy really mattered to the Allies, or at least to the Western Allies. And so you can see in that timeline, the 8th of November, Eisenhower, Supreme Commander in the Mediterranean, he called for Rome to be captured. So they prioritized get to Rome. Maybe not Italy, but just get to Rome. We're there, let's get to Rome. And the Bernhardt line was to be broken. If you look at the map, the Bernhardt line is the sort of branch. See the red line? The Bernhardt line, the Gustav line, the Bernhardt line, when they call it the winter line, the Bernhardt line at this point, that's December 1943, rather, it was south of Gaeta. And so Eisenhower wanted the line broken and for the Allies to smash through. Now, on the 25th of November, that was the first time that the Shingle or the Anzio amphibious operation was actually an outline plan approved. So the plan of taking Rome quickly always called for an amphibious landing, so to outflank the defensive lines. And then on the 27th of November, my father was involved in this. The 8th Army attack on the Bernhardt Line on the east took place. So there was this huge effort right across the Bernhardt Line. So on the Adriatic coast, the 8th Army assaulted north of the Sandground, broke the line, and then ran out of steam. We'll talk about that in due course as the Canadians took over the advance in the Adriatic and went on to Altona. And we can talk about what went wrong, what went right on that. Now, the really important point is 28th of November, 1943, the Tehran Conference. Now, at the Tehran Conference, that's when it was agreed with Churchill, and you can see him in the picture, Roosevelt and Stalin, that Operation Overlord, the invasion of Europe, would definitely take place in 1944, probably in May. So at that point, the Allies suddenly, their whole priority shifted. It's now Europe, Northwest Europe, it's the Normandy landing, but nevertheless, the decision was made before with Eisenhower calling for Rome to be taken and all the resources been put in and said, come on, you've got some few months, let's get Rome, let's get it all sorted out, and then we're going to focus on Northwest Europe. So we had another big battle on the 1st of December, the second attack on Monte Cammino, and I've been there. It's an absolutely formidable mountain, and a huge amount of blood was expended capturing this peak south of Cassino. And then again on the 5th of December, the Canadians are given this, keep driving through up to Pescara, and they want to get to Pescara so they can get over and cut off Rome. And it's all about getting into Rome as quickly as possible. On the 7th of December, you have the Battle of the Vignano Gap, and we heard that around this time, in 1943, the Battle of San Pietro in Fine took place. And then 11th of December, Churchill falls ill in Tunis, and this is quite a significant moment. And meanwhile, the attempt to break through the Bernhardt Line is continuing. So the New Zealanders, mainly, and Ausonia, right in the middle of Italy, that was launched on the 15th of December. It failed. On the 17th of December, the French Expeditionary Corps, for the first time, is given a major role in the Allied campaign. And I'll come to that in a minute, to take a high point north of Venafro. And then on the 25th of December, they all gather together in Carthage. And there's Winston Churchill in his dressing gown, because he's recovering from his pneumonia and a small heart attack. And look at that cast of characters. Starting second from left, that's Arthur Tenner, who's about to be dispatched to move over to take over the air command of the air operations in Overlord. In the front next to Churchill's Eisenhower, who has already been named to be head of the operation in Northwest Europe, Supreme Commander. On the right, the guy with the rather neat-looking jacket, that's Walter Bedell Smith. He's Eisenhower's number 2, and he gets shifted over to Northwest Europe as well. And then there might be some others, but in the background, right in the middle, you see Field Marshal Alexander at this point. No, he's not Field Marshal, he's a general. And he was eventually going to take over from the large fellow on the right in the front, the bald guy, and that's Jumbo Maitland, who this time was the Supreme Commander in the Mediterranean. He was the overall coordinator of Allied operations, the whole Mediterranean theatre. So this was the cast of characters in December 1943. Go on a year, and the most significant ones are not in Italy. They're all in Europe, trying to smash through and get into Germany. So I thought that was quite an interesting photograph. And then Churchill, he relocates to Marrakesh on the 27th of December for the air, so the lungs can dry out. And he doesn't go back to Britain until the 7th of February. So it's an amazing amount of time for him to be out of London. And I just want to show this picture because it's quite an important moment for the French Expeditionary Corps. On the left is the 5th Moroccan Rifle Regiment, and there's 2 men from the and they have taken the Monte Pantano, which is north of Venafro, and that picture on the right is that is Monte Pantano. It's more than 5,000 foot tall, and that's north of Venafro. So if you get to the top of that, you can look north and see Cassino. And this very successful assault by the Moroccans convinced Mark Clark that they could use the French Expeditionary Corps in mountain fighting. And the Moroccans, if you look at them, you see they're not Goumier. You know, people say Goumier. These are Moroccan regular forces, and they're equipped with American kit. So it's not the Goumier wearing the jalaba and the turban. These are wearing the American kit because it had been agreed that the French Expeditionary Corps would be equipped and commanded by the Americans, not the British. Anyway, let's move on. Any comment on this? I'll go back to that picture because I think that inspires things in your mind, doesn't it, Joe?
Yeah, so we're starting off with basically Churchill's illness, Just for context, Churchill throughout the Second World War flew a total of 111,000 miles by ship or plane. He traveled, that amount by ship or plane during the Second World War. Majority of it actually by plane, because he traveled a lot by air. Obviously, it would have been it would have been asinine to do those journeys entirely by ship. He had to travel by air, and he spent a total of 339 hours in the air by September 1943 alone. So this is in the lead up to him falling ill. So presumably he was approaching probably about 400 hours, or he was very nearly there by the time he got to Tunisia. And he had just literally gotten off a flight from Cairo, and essentially was sat on the tarmac, and it was noted by a staff officer, basically, that was with the flight. He flew around on a B-24 Liberator that was specially outfitted, and essentially he got off the aircraft, and he essentially had beads of sweat on his forehead. He was sweating profusely and looked particularly ill, and it was noted that he was ill upon boarding the flight in Cairo. In many respects, he shouldn't have been allowed on the plane. He was already really reeling at that particular point. And, the aircraft that he would have flown on would have varied from the Avro York, the Ascalon, and he did some journeys on the C-54, also known as the DC-4 aircraft, which is basically a pressurized aircraft that was used by Roosevelt on a regular basis, and also later used by Douglas MacArthur to fly to Japan. But and he did flying boat travel, but he also flew in a Liberator. His first journey to Moscow was on a Liberator, and those aircraft were used quite regularly. So this is a person who travels quite frequently, and he's just come back from Tehran and from the Cairo conference. And he's kind of, his power and influence on a global stage as a sort of a war leader is waning by comparison to the growing power of Roosevelt and Stalin. And he really actually, in the grand scheme of things, he kind of got badly done over at Tehran and was kind of shown up a little bit by Roosevelt. It was something of a betrayal. But when he falls ill in Tunisia, and this is essentially an outline of what takes place, he falls ill for the second time that year with a very bad case of pneumonia. And he also has 2 episodes of atrial fibrillation when he basically arrives at Eisenhower's headquarters, basically located on the old site of the old Carthaginian capital, Carthage, at the edge of Tunis. And he basically had contracted a severe cold on his way back from Tehran, and it just developed into an infection. So he's staying at this private villa near Tunis, and he describes being on the broad of my back amid the ruins of ancient Carthage. He has a fever which reached at its height 101 degrees Fahrenheit, and he was tended to by his personal physician, Lord Moran, who summoned numerous specialists from as far afield as London, and also American and British medical teams. And they decided also that they needed to take an X-ray, for which they had to find what was the only X-ray machine in the whole of North Africa, which I believe was in Cairo. And he was treated. The treatment that was administered was with sulfonamide drugs, specifically. I think it was called sulfadiazine, which is also known as MMB 760. And they were going to treat him with penicillin. But at that particular point, penicillin was very pioneering in the world. Like, the development of penicillin as an actual drug was still in a very pioneering phase. They had administered it to wounded soldiers with great effect, but it was still a very cutting edge. And they decided not to treat him with penicillin because they weren't entirely certain whether it would have a good effect on his condition. But ultimately he began to recover, but it took him weeks to recover. Bear in mind, it's early December by the time he gets to, it's 11th of December, he arrives at that villa. and he's not able to get out of bed until Christmas Eve 1943. So he's in bed for a couple of weeks, and he's still directing business. But there was a couple of days, particularly in the early points there, where it was very touch and go. He possibly could have died. It was a very, very serious infection. If his heart gave out, Lord Moran expressed his own personal sort of appreciation of how bad it was. He said if he's going to be ill, we don't have anything here in this godforsaken spot with which to treat him. So it was a bit of a crisis situation, and it resulted in a profoundly worried reaction on the part of many Allied commanders. Eisenhower was very concerned. A lot of British commanders were particularly concerned because they didn't have as much confidence in any potential successor, whether it be Athley or any of Churchill's deputies or Eden, for them to carry the war forward with as much vigor and determination. You also must remember that Churchill, by this point in the war, was almost like a spiritual figurehead for the entire Allied cause. He had created the victory sign, he had done all of that, and he branded the Allied image. So he was really the most important figurehead. And even Joe Stalin sent a telegram to Churchill, basically through the Foreign Office, conveying his own anxiety at Churchill's condition and wishing him a speedy recovery. And I think this communication was rather genuine. I've seen the actual communication or translation of it in the National Archives. And Stalin was concerned, and I think he had good reason to be concerned, because Churchill was the person that was going to basically, they had made the guarantee of the Second Front to happen within about 6 months of the Tehran conference. And I think Stalin was relying on Churchill as much as anybody to deliver on that. So there's a lot at stake with Churchill's potential decline and death in this particular location. But thankfully he recovers. And I think I will maybe we could save the conversation for what happens with Churchill until next week, when Christmas Eve and Christmas Day are upon us, to actually talk about how this incident actually turns out in the end. I find it one of the most moving episodes of the Second World War in terms of the genuine bonds that were forged between the key figures of what we now know as the Grand Alliance.
Yeah, the Churchill at this point had just had his 70th birthday. So he was born in November, so he was 70 at this point. Life expectancy in Britain at this point probably was less than 70. Now, this is a man who, by all accounts, apart from smoking cigars almost continuously, was also dosing himself regularly with, a very considerable amount of hard liquor. And so I'm sure they probably thought, well, he's going to go. We're going to lose him. I don't know. You wonder when everybody turns up. They just want to check up either he's dead or alive. I mean, they all showed up.
Absolutely. Well, his daughter flew in to be by his side, and she was pregnant. I have to say,
Cunningham. There's a naval officer there behind. I don't know who that is. It's not Cunningham.
I had wondered whether that was Dudley Pound. It's not Cunningham anyway. It's definitely a Royal Navy officer anyway, but quite senior. But I don't.
It's a power photograph. It's a power photograph, isn't it?
It is. A lot of key.
I'm not sure if there's ever one with so much power. The only person missing, of course, is Roosevelt, and of course, the person who's not there, who figures very significant, is Patton. Yeah. At this point, Patton, feeling marginalised, is in Morocco, still training troops and thinking his career's over. I was in Sicily anyway, but he's not in it. But of course, he plays a very important role, and so does Omar Bradley. But anyway, let's move on.
Can I make a recommendation to our viewers about this particular incident? So 2 things that I'd recommend reading. So if you want to read in brief, the International Churchill Society has an article which was published on 2nd of December on the anniversary, basically, of this particular episode, called Christmas in Carthage. So I wish I'd published an article about it for the National Archives when I worked for them. But anyway, International Churchill Society, Christmas in Carthage. And if you want to read a more detailed, more academic view from a medical perspective, there's a very good article which I have read when I was researching this incident. It was written by a J.A. Vale and published in 2017 by the National Institutes of Health, presumably an American institution. And it's an academic article, runs to about just over 15, 16 pages, which you can access online. It's J.A. Vale and J.W. Scalding, In Carthage Ruins, the Illness of Sir Winston Churchill at Carthage, December 43. So highly recommend reading those sources.
And the other part of it, of course, he's out of Britain. He's out of London. He's already been out of London for almost a month. He's out of London until early February. So the reality is that the government, or the day-to-day affairs of government, have been run by Clement Attlee, Major Clement Attlee, Labour leader, and he's running the detailed affairs of government. And of course, in July 1945, Bob's your uncle, he becomes Prime Minister. So let's move on to 1944. And here we go. And it's just one of the most dramatic moments in the Second World War. It's really up there, the Battle of the Bulge. We know that it was in the Ardennes and the weather was pretty appalling. It's snowing. Those American troops, I'm not sure. I think it's probably later on. And let me quickly, for people, the strategy was, you can see these German armies, and they were aiming to break through the Ardennes, get to Antwerp. So Antwerp's up in the top left, and the red line is basically, that's the objectives. That's the ultimate objective. And in the middle is the River Meuse. I mean, obviously the River Meuse is strategically important, but once you're over the River Meuse, you're out of the Ardennes, and then you're into the plains. That was the objective. And you can see, if you look at the map, I mean, Cologne's up in the top right. It's a huge front. It's about 50 miles at least. And that was the objective. So just a couple of words about why. And you could write several books on it. That it's deemed to be really Hitler's battle. It's the one he wanted, by this point shaken by the disloyalty that he believed in the high command of the German armed forces. By this point, he had arrested hundreds of thousands, literally thousands of people in Germany involved in the attempt to blow him up in July, including senior commanders. Rommel's gone, he's dead. There was an amazing amount of secrecy. I put the question mark after that because there's some question about, the question is, how could the Allies who were occupying the front, how could they be caught out by, we're talking about three armies. We're talking about 150,000 men, tanks and everything. How could they be caught out? The aim was basically to split the American and British, reach the Meuse in 2 days. So it's a really, and I've got to thank Paul Woodage of World War TV for a terrific series on this. There's about 4 or 5 documentaries I suggest you have access to. But one of the observations mate, is that the Germans were using what they call Russian tactics. They've been influenced by the experience in the Eastern Front, and what they call Russian tactics is for very aggressive punches with just press on. And they sent small formations in the lead to break through and bypass major strong points, one of them being Bastogne, and also be very ruthless. From the beginning, it seems that the German armies were told, don't take prisoners, just shoot them. And the lead formations were SS, and they were using what's called Russian tactics. So they just shot a lot of people out of hand, including civilians. But I think the overall view is that it was strategically incoherent. At this point, there was no way that this battle was going to change the way the war was going to go. So why would do it? And it made no sense. And a key factor was the lack of supplies and air cover, and the roads were generally considered to be completely inadequate for the scale of the forces. And this was the other thing. And the weather was initially advantageous. I want a couple of more slides. I'm going to have a little chat. This is a map showing, basically, see the red line, that's as far as the Germans got by I think it was the 25th of December, 26th of December. So they're punched all the way through, hence the expression bulge, bulging out to the west, but they were really nowhere near Antwerp. And that's about as far as they got. They didn't even cross the Meuse. So that's the geography. It's a huge area. It's a massive battle. This gives the scale. So by the 16th of January, the Allies had 700,000 men in theatre, and it's the largest battle for the American army in the Second World War in terms of the number of men involved. The Germans had around 400,000 men, and you can look at the imbalance between tanks. Almost 2,500 Allied tanks, 200 German tanks, so it's very unbalanced. And the casualties are really startling. The Americans lost 81,000 casualties, 8,400 killed, 46,000 wounded. And the Germans lost, they estimate, up to 75,000. It was a huge battle, and there were 3,000 civilian casualties. This is just a bit of fun. Most of us are aware of the Battle of the Bulge from films and what we've seen on telly. So the one at the top is generally regarded just about the worst film ever made of the Second World War. It's the Battle of the Bulge, which is filmed in Spain, so it was nothing like the area. The tanks are, of course, wrong. It's generally regarded as a joke, but not far behind in terms of quality is the Battle of the Bulge, which was made, I think, about 10 years ago. And it's generally regarded as ridiculous as well. Of course, everybody has loves this one. And that is Band of Brothers, and that's my neighbour, Damien Lewis, lives up the road. And 101st Overboard is just an astonishingly good. But of course, it doesn't capture the scale because it's just really basically one company in part of the front. And it focuses on the Bastogne area, which is surrounded. This is only part of the story, in fact, a comparatively small part of the whole story. And I wanted to do this because this is taken from Patton, the film Patton. And this is a picture which you look at it and you can see. They don't explain who's in it, but it starts off with an unnamed British brigadier saying, what we're going to do about it. Eisenhower wants us to try and break through. And Patton in the middle says, I can get the Third Army up there in 3 days. Bradley, who is Army Group commander, so Patton is reporting to Bradley. The Army Group has been cut in two by the thrust. And he has a chat, Patton says, to Gwingo. I cannot pronounce his name. He's the chief of staff for Montgomery. Montgomery's not there. And he says, General Montgomery can't get there for weeks. And then sitting in the front is Tedder. So that's supposed to be Tedder. So, and the whole tone of this meeting, and it's really one of the most important scenes in the whole film, is that there they were, the Allies were in a serious difficulty. Patton was the one who came to the rescue, and the Third Army did it. And Montgomery was being typically Montgomery-ish and didn't do anything, or not much. This is the structure that the Montgomery at that point was in charge of the 21st Army Group, which had the Canadian First Army, the British Second Army. Omar Bradley's Army Group was the 3 divisions, First Army, Third Army, and Ninth Army. And what happened is that the day after this meeting in Verdun on the 19th, Eisenhower placed Montgomery in charge of the northern flank on the 20th of December. So if you watch the film, you think that Montgomery's not doing anything. But in fact, the day after that meeting took place in Verdun, Eisenhower says to Montgomery, I want you to take command of the two American armies, which are actually in Bradley's command, in his command. And there are reports that the Germans said this was the turning point in the battle, not Bastogne. It was when the northern flank of the attack was taken over by Montgomery in a coordinating. And that's Zita Ballinger from Fletcher. That's the point she made. And then Clark, who was a brigadier, and that's his photograph on the left. He's an American officer, and he said that Montgomery was the best general of the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, well, everybody's got their opinions. But that is against the conventional analysis. Zita said that Eisenhower was already at this point looking to the post-war situation. And definitely Patton said, he said that Eisenhower in the autumn of 1944 was already entertaining electoral hopes. The view in the Allies by November, and certainly the American public, that the war was effectively over. And that it was just, so people's eyes were not on the ball. And that's one of the factors. And there's definitely, and this again is Zita, who said to American, she said there was a deliberate attempt to try and undermine the British view, because the breakthrough, and they went through Bradley's Army Group, the breakthrough was really mainly, it was initially a very serious defeat for the Americans. And it was important for Eisenhower, and not just him, to assert that, in fact, the Americans, we're winning this, and that, it's an American operation. And that's partly to do with post-war considerations. So again, from Zita. So she argues that the Ardennes really was the most important because it was the most effective Allied cooperation of the war. Not so much the Bastogne, but it was actually an operation of great coordination. The Battle of the North, which was really a major element of it, which was where the 21st Army Group and Montgomery was commanding. You hear a lot about Bastogne and Nuts, but this was comparatively a small part of the story. The Anglo-American link-up spelled doom for the offensive. The key was coordination. And anyway, so one of the points that came out from this discussion, Joe, and let's talk about it now, is the suspicion that somebody knew that it was happening. The argument made is that Ultra, at the highest levels, at Schaefer level, knew something was happening. They were getting knowledge. But at the operational level, it wasn't getting through. So there wasn't total surprise. And one of the points that Zita made, and I'm not going to argue for or against it, is that to an extent, the Allies, in order to finish off the Germans effectively, they had to get the Germans. The Germans had to be lured into a trap. They had to come from behind the Siegfried Line and lose massively because the Hürtgen Forest had been a bit of a disaster, which was the American operation. Market Garden had also been basically a failure. The Germans at this point behind the Rhine, behind the Siegfried Line. So they needed the Germans to come out so they could be crushed. And to a certain extent, strategically allowing the German armies to advance in the way they did, provide an opportunity for the Allies to crush and basically destroy three armies. Anyway, Joe, what do you think?
Well, Eddie, I'm not entirely certain you've left me with much to say, really. You've given a kind of a...
Well, you can agree with me, Joe. You can say you're dead right.
Well, I just wanted to just basically sort of just outline just the basic premise of it, and just sort of, and there's a number of key points to be made right throughout. So first of all, begins on the 16th of December, as you've mentioned, and it's the last major surprise offensive that Hitler will launch, against either side. Either the Soviets advancing from the east or the Western Allied forces advancing, obviously coming from the west, coming out of France into Germany. And, the key objective from an Allied perspective is to clear the ground in order to get on their, basically the Western side of the Rhine and prepare. This is the reason why this particular operation is called Operation, the Germans name it Operation Wacht am Rhein, which is basically watch on the Rhine, because it's all about defending the Rhine. It's all about pushing the Allies back from the Rhine and just basically pushing them back into their own hinterland as far as possible, capturing as many supply sites, because the Germans, they've, at this point, they have lost Ploesti in Romania, and they have very quickly lost a lot of sites of supply and refinement. So they're going to run out of fuel. It's only a matter of months before they're going to be completely out of fuel. So whatever fuel reserves they have, they're going to plow them into this offensive in the hope that they will capture. And it is that part which is portrayed in the movie, The Battle of the Bulge, the 1960s one, which you and many others have written off as a stinker. That is correct. Those big objectives for the panzer units were to secure supply depots, and particularly fuel sites, to fuel the basically the advance with captured raw material, particularly fuel. And also, they knew it was coming, because in the week or two that led up to the launch of the operation, you had Allied units in the forward areas, very thinly spread, particularly in the American First Army area. And the American First Army take the brunt of this offensive. Essentially, they're hearing heavy units, tracked units, armored vehicles, tanks. They're hearing all this moving around in front of them in the hills that are basically lying in front of them, the high ground. And they're hearing all these vehicles moving around, and in certain parts of the line, the noise is quite deafening. So they know that something is coming, and it's been reported back. I think the Allies had made a calculation that they were going to take the brunt of whatever was going to come, but there was a supply problem They couldn't. They had to basically build up their supply stocks. They'd really exhausted a lot of their munitions and fuel supplies, and they could really only, at that particular point in the war, afford, shall we say, a defense with what we might call today quick reaction movements or quick reaction forces coming to reinforce certain areas that suddenly come under attack. So they're trying to save up supplies as much as possible for the push into Germany, because they do have a number of campaigns. They're only just coming to the end of the Hürtgen Forest campaign, which was a bloody massacre. And then suddenly this happens. So it is a crisis. It causes them to rush reinforcements and supplies as quickly as possible. Eisenhower has to basically, get off, come back from whatever holiday he's on or whatever trip he's on, and make sure that he goes somewhere close to where the front line is in order to meet American troops, appear in front of the newsreel cameras, and boost morale. And in the immediate aftermath of the German advance, killings do occur. You have the Malmedy massacre happening the day after the launch of the operation on December 16th, where SS troops kill captured POWs in an open area. And there's some dispute about the circumstances in which this took place, whether it was deliberate or whether they opened fire on troops that were basically getting a little bit out of hand or had been spooked. There's all sorts of variations of this story, but there's a general acceptance that it was a deliberate massacre, and that basically this was characteristic of the kind of tactics that SS units used when they suddenly arrived with a number of prisoners and were forced to move on. And they couldn't parole the prisoners, and they couldn't pass them on to follow-up units because they're moving so fast, so they basically execute them. Other people may disagree with me on that. As I said, there's a few academic papers that are written about what actually happened at Malmedy on the basis of various different accounts. Excuse me. But it is notable that they moved the 101st Airborne Division, as well as it wasn't just the 101st. It was there were other units as well, including I believe an element of an African American unit and some leftover elements from the U.S. First Army, regular U.S. soldiers that were not specialists like the 101st, that basically were moved into Bastogne and that were very quickly encircled by advancing units. Now, there is all sorts of, again, revisionism about how important Bastogne was in terms of the Battle of the Bulge. There's a general consensus that the denial of the key, it was a crossroads essentially that they were defending around that town, and that basically that town had to be secured by the Germans in order to basically ensure ease of access of routes going to particular places like Saint Vite and various different other key locations, key towns that they had to capture. And obviously they're building up basically to sort of attempt crossing of the Meuse. And the response of Montgomery at this particular point, and bear in mind that the British are also being hit. There's air offensives that have been launched. You have the Luftwaffe, which is resurrected from near destruction. It's rebuilt in the months that are leading up to Wacht am Rhein. And the Luftwaffe basically returns as a mighty force. You have Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft, Messerschmitt 109s, built in large numbers, and you also have bomber aircraft. They even use Stukas. So they have a very effective Luftwaffe force, which is involved providing air support, and they're flying in. There's a lot of bad weather at this particular point, which inhibits Allied operations. And Allied air operations are so finely tuned at this particular point that they do need good weather in order for bombing offensives, basically bombing operations, to be effective. So they need a clearance in this rough weather, whereas the Luftwaffe are prepared to fly their air support missions in bad weather, even if the results are particularly limited. And it's around the lead up to Christmas for the 101st Airborne, and the 101st Airborne actually recently celebrated in the town of Bastogne. They had the Nuts Parade, and this is in honor of the famous response by General McAuliffe, who was commanding the 101st Airborne Division, even though he was the deputy commander. He was the deputy commander of the 101st Airborne Division. General Maxwell Taylor, the actual commander of the 101st, was actually away at the time. He wasn't on the continent of Europe. I think he might have been in the UK or somewhere else, but he was actually away, and he tried to get back as quickly as possible. But Brigadier General McAuliffe rushed the 101st in as quickly as possible with barely enough winter clothing and enough ammunition or supplies. They got as much as they could from supply dumps here and there, and First Army units that were retreating, supplying them with, and retreating soldiers handing over their kits. And they went in there and basically effectively entrenched themselves all around the town and defended, effectively lightly armed units by comparison to the units that were attacking them, held them off for at least a week, if not 10 days, until Patton was able to come to their relief. But when the Germans approached the Americans with an emissary to basically communicate a message to their commanding general, the commanding general basically effectively receives, McAuliffe receives this note basically asking for the American surrender. And General McAuliffe famously replies to the German commander, "Nuts." So it's a very simple, clear response, which has become legendary, and it's something that the 101st Airborne celebrate Bastogne almost as much as they celebrate any other campaign that they fought in any conflict. And bear in mind that they predate the Second World War. They were also involved in the First World War as well. This is something that they celebrate probably more than any other incident in any other war, because this was their determination in the face of overwhelming odds, and this is what they were trained to do. And a very common gripe among a lot of 101st Airborne soldiers was that Patton and Third Army basically stole their thunder, that we didn't need to be bloody rescued. We were doing just fine until they showed up and spoiled everything. So there's a lot of disgruntlement among 101st World War II veterans who were at Bastogne about this whole thing, because they felt that Patton and Third Army stole too much glory away from what they were actually accomplishing. We can talk about this campaign in more detail at a later point, particularly next week, because I'd like to actually discuss what the offshoot consequences were, particularly in terms of the legacy of what happened at the Battle of the Ardennes, and also we have to talk about the Montgomery press conference, which happens in early January 1945. This has a massive impact upon perceptions of who did more in this particular campaign. But as a prelude to that particular conversation, Eddie, in terms of what the significance was in terms of the Anglo-American relationship, and it did have a detrimental impact which lasted for years to come. It really soured things between Eisenhower and Monty, almost really until the end of the war. But it is important to note that at a particular point, Churchill would personally intervene in the aftermath of this offensive as it was going the Allied way over the Montgomery press conference. And I'll go into more detail about this because I've written about this particular incident.
Oh, right. Well, look.
Yeah, but I just wanted to say that in the Battle of the Bulge, the Americans, the reason this is an important battle from an American perspective, and Churchill made this point in the House of Commons, they lose more men in this battle than they lost at the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yeah.
So it is a very important battle from an American perspective at a psychological point of view. And this is basically, you might call it, I know this is a very Irish term, but this is basically the American blood sacrifice for the liberation of Europe. We are seeing it happening during this offensive.
Well, I mean, we can discuss it further, but it's kind of connected because I show that, and I suggest people go and look at the film Patton, because there is this wonderful scene. It's in Verdun. They don't actually say it's in Verdun, but that's where it took place. And they have an unnamed British brigadier who's doing the briefing, and you've got that room, and that's the moment. And it's the moment where, said, I can have them ready in 3 days. And the Gwingo says, well, we take us weeks. And he said, well, that's what my boys are trained for. I trained them. It's a really important moment in which Patton is the hero and the star. And so that's on the 19th. But on the 20th, I know you come to it, Joe, the next day, the reality is, and that's not in Patton, the reality is that Montgomery is appointed by Eisenhower to take command of the whole Northern Front, including 2 American divisions. Now, when that came out, what did Bradley do? And he's in that scene, in that he says to Eisenhower, so if Eisenhower phones him up and says, I'm going to take 2 of your divisions, I'm going to put them under Montgomery. Bradley says, the American people will never tolerate this. And if you do it, I'm going to resign. He threatened to resign right in the middle of the battle. And Eisenhower said, all right, okay, well, you know, it's going to happen. And of course, that was the first aggravation. There was an aggravation that was going. The Americans were already sick of the patronizing, superior British approach, which they were sick of. And they had put up with it. I mean, it's the same people. It's Bradley and Patton and Eisenhower and Montgomery who are in Italy. So they've already been putting up with all this stuff. And so they put, you know, but the thing that does it, and then is the 7th of January when Montgomery, he does a press conference and he doesn't realize he's done anything wrong. And he says, if you ever make a briefing, drop out all the words with I in it. Never say, I did this and I knew that and I saw that. Just say, instead of saying, I knew the weather was going to be bad, you say the weather is bad as predicted. But Montgomery, because he's got some kind of Asperger's condition, isolated, he's been a widower for more than 10 years. He's living in his caravan. He has no permanent home. It's been destroyed. And he's an isolated, lonely man with the burden of high command on his shoulder and the responsibility of hundreds of thousands of lives. And he goes to the press conference and he thought he'd be very generous to the Americans. He thought he couldn't understand what went wrong. Eisenhower phoned him up and was furious. And he still didn't understand it. And then in the end, Churchill had to go. And we'll come to it, Joe. Joe had to go to the House of Commons and basically apologize to the Americans and say the Americans played an important role. And you are quite right that this poison continued for decades, right up until the late 1950s, right in the last year of Eisenhower's presidency. And that kind of tone, and the issue here is, I think, for people who consider the Second World War, and we talk about tactics and equipment and technology and army commanders, but there's a huge amount of personal politics at work, huge amount. And the point, and I watched the film, which is Patton's Last Days, which you mentioned. I had watched it, and they actually show Patton in the car with Hap, or anyway, his chief of staff, and saying, Eisenhower, this is November 1945. He says, Eisenhower's changed. He's now got his eyes set on the White House. And there is a feeling that a lot of the American commanders at this point were thinking the war's over. It's done. The American people think it's over. We're going to be back. The boys are coming back. And they had this terrible shock with massive casualties. Again, you know, young lads being killed in huge numbers and wounded. And it was a huge shock, political shock in America.
Yeah.
And in many respects, the reason why Eisenhower had to do this, and they probably encouraged by Roosevelt, was to, you know, to tell the American people and say, well, we did a tremendous job and it was us who did it and we weren't saved by the British. A lot of politics coming into it. Anyway, Joe, please shoot.
Well, the point I was going to make, so you have gone through the sort of the, shall we say, the details of the Montgomery press conference. I will go into it. I think it's an anniversary that we should mark of its own because it's acquired so much significance, particularly in recent times with regard to the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge and what happened. And you're outlining 2 very important facts, which is basically this is, other than Kasserine Pass, this is probably one of the worst moments for the Americans in the war. It really is about, and also the fall of the Philippines and the surrender of Wainwright and the American forces fighting on the Philippines. It's a really bad moment for the Americans. It's a bit of a psychological blow. And also it's horrific for the American public because the losses are just so catastrophic. They haven't, as I mentioned before, these are casualties which are just about surpassing the scale of Civil War battles. And the Civil War was, you know, it cost them more lives than any other conflict. including, I mean, the Civil War cost lives of more Americans than both the First and Second World Wars put together, which is quite a lot. So when you have a battle that's taking place where the scale of the casualties, and they're coming, you know, they're facing, even though the Germans, it's a damp squib really in the end, and it's sort of the German offensive runs out of momentum. What they are hit with initially is basically the kind of steamroller type thing that the Soviets were hit with in Barbarossa in 1941, what hit the west of Europe in 1940, and this is something that the Americans have not come up against on a massive scale, particularly not in this area where, you know, it was more or less a repeat of the same kind of tactics in 1940, where they lined up in the Ardennes and basically came through. And like 1940, May 1940, when the German units were basically getting lined up, ready to go in the Ardennes, they're also bricking themselves as well about the possibility of Allied air power coming in and wiping them out on these woodland lanes throughout the Ardennes forest. So, and it's crazy to think that the Allies didn't really fully appreciate what was about to hit them. Possibly they did, but there was very little they could do about it, and they just basically had to hold the line, come what may. But the political effect in the United States and the level of stress that this put political and military leaders under, because they'd not really prepared for this at all. And the scale of the losses, it leads to quite a lot of blame, leads to quite a lot of stress. The Americans are very touchy at this particular point. And so the British, being as well-meaning as possible and trying, particularly with Montgomery and Churchill, trying to placate the Americans, they become acutely aware that the Americans have grown tired and of sort of their alliance with the British, in terms of relying on the British for support. They indulged, Eisenhower and the Americans indulged Monty for Operation Market Garden and the invasion of the Netherlands. They gave the 21st Army Group the support, the material support, and also the use of their airborne units, the 101st and the 82nd, in order to cross the Rhine in the northern sector. That didn't work. And then basically they ended up with this overextended front line running to the north, where there were considerable weaknesses, and it kind of weakened them in the south. And, you know, if they know that if they'd given those resources to Patton, there's a good chance that they'd already be in Germany by this point. And Patton had proved his mettle in this particular respect. So as far as the Americans are concerned, they backed the wrong horse in order to placate an ally. And then in the middle of this offensive, they find the British being less than useful, particularly in terms of Monty's press conference. But one point that I did make, and I will share this at a later point when we discuss the anniversary of the Monty press conference. Monty's press conference didn't come across as bad as the reportage that came after the press conference, which later transpired to be German black propaganda. And this created a slanging match between the British and American media. And you got the Hearst papers, you got the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail all weighing in on this, and it's a transatlantic public relations disaster which scars the Allies for ages to come. And what I would have to say is that actually, in the grand scheme of things, the outcome of this was actually for the best, because what it ended up happening was Monty ended up being paired with the one American commander that he could work with, and their partnership actually sealed the deal in Northwest Germany in 1945. So the outcome was actually positive despite the tragic consequences. But we'll go into more detail on those points.
No, I mean, you know, it's fascinating stuff, Joe, and your insights are really terrific. And I think, I'm going to make a couple of closing points and then we'll move on and close the show, is that there's some evidence that Montgomery never really recovered from this, that his post-war career was blighted. Not surprisingly, if you are depicted in several feature films as being a sluggish, you know, hopelessly stuck up snob, you know, and that's how you're depicted in history, your whole perception. So the Patton film, of course, Montgomery, I think, was still alive at that point. The Patton film depicts Montgomery as an intolerable snob and a bit of an idiot. But he was affected negatively about psychologically, and he was a vulnerable person anyway, considering, despite the fact that he had so much influence and power. But the other part about it, and I think is that when you look at the Second World War, the really important matters are the political decisions. These are the important things. So the Tehran conference, when Roosevelt, Stalin, Churchill got together and they agreed overlord, that was the critical moment, one of the most important meetings in the war, because now they decided the date for overlord, and that was it. And that moment, of course, Italy, which at that point had been the main priority, of course, the major priority in the Western Europe, became a second-rate front. But there was still the legacy of the previous decisions. So Eisenhower had already issued instructions to his commanders, take Rome. So all the commanders had done their detailed planning, they got the logistics in place, they were all ready. And suddenly on the 27th of November, they say, sorry, lads, we're going to be going into Northwest Europe, and we want you to send troops, divisions. Divisions were moved out of Italy. Transport that was going to be used in the amphibious operation was removed. So the Italian commanders, the people in the field, huge forces at their disposal, are dealing with the unconsidered, the implications of a top-level political decision. Like people at the top, you've experienced that, Joe, I'm sure. People at the top make all these high-level strategic decisions, and they don't realize that the people at the bottom are still trying to extricate themselves from the previous strategy. And that's what you've got. And I think politics, not enough emphasis in the Second World War on the political decisions. Even the role of the French Expeditionary Corps here in Italy. That was a really seminal moment, which led to the rebirth of the French army and then the French state post-war at this point. So there's so many, as you can tell, I'm a high politics guy. And I'm a kind of personal relationship guy. And I think, you're the expert on history. Joe, anyway, last thoughts?
Well, the last thoughts I would say is if Montgomery came across as overbearing, overconfident, arrogant, he got his comeuppance really in 1944. And I think by the time it came to the Battle of the Bulge, actually, I think he exercised quite a lot of humility. If you look at his press conference, it might have been considered to be bungled, but there's a lot of British historians who've looked at the wording of it. Yeah. Perhaps the delivery was poor, but the wording of it was incredibly complimentary and whatever like that. And it came across as disingenuous to an American audience, I can appreciate. But from a British perspective, that was not, it's not the British style to overlay praise and essentially excessive expressions of confidence upon, and actually to acknowledge that the Americans are now the senior partners in this particular regard and whatever, and that Ike is our captain and and all this. This is not a British style. It's not something that somebody like Monty, who came from kind of a stiff-collared kind of military background.
Well, no, he wasn't military. His father was a bishop.
Yes, exactly. This is not their style. This is an incredible act of humility, and it's an almost a bowing to to American superiority, and just basically saying we are with you and we have your back and we'll do whatever it takes. And the Americans are reacting in a way that this is really politics coming to the fore. This is basically, you see this in any particular team when things start to get stressful. We've all encountered it. Basically, people start snapping at one another and biting at one another's heels. The person I'm most surprised at is Bradley, because Bradley is always portrayed as this very gentle-souled soldier, and very smiley, very humble, sort of the opposite of Patton, a compassionate person and whatever like that. In this particular case, he shows himself as an army group commander to be somewhat wanting by comparison to Monty, who, as a result of the situation, and we'll go into it again, ends up building an amazing working partnership with General William Simpson, or Texas Bill Simpson, at the head of the 9th Army, and becomes effectively overall commander, but without imposing himself upon the 9th Army commanders, basically, and working in partnership with Bill Simpson. And essentially, in this working partnership goes up all the way to basically the launch of Varsity and Operation Plunder, the crossing of the Rhine, which is basically, this is where these armies jointly lead this attack. And like, I mean, between the pair of them, they roll up Germany, they roll up Western Germany in about 6 weeks. And they also make sure that the Soviets don't have complete superior, that they don't get into Denmark and have complete supremacy over the Baltic area. They accomplished that together, and it speaks more to Monty's ability as an army group commander. He did actually have the ability to be a coalition commander, but we only see this very belatedly at the end of the war, that he had that talent and he had the ability when was necessary to wind his neck in. But unfortunately, the reputation that he has as a result of what happens during this offensive and afterwards, a lot of it not brought upon himself, is, it's the result of built-up tensions and just bloody politics. And it's the result, I think, ultimately, what we are seeing is the United States of America finally rising as a superpower to the point where they can actually treat their allies in this manner.
Yep, I think you're onto something there, Joe. Because you're Irish, so you being fruity is sort of your middle name. You like a bit of overstatement. Montgomery, it just is painful to listen to British officers at this point, and their idea of motivating speech would say, "Come on, chaps, we're not doing that badly, and never mind, things will be better tomorrow. Mustn't grumble." That was the British style. Whereas, Patton was, for all his faults, I mean, he didn't hold back when he made a motivational talk. He made a motivational talk.
Yeah. So, speaking of Patton, I noticed that one of the anniversaries, and we haven't covered a lot of the anniversaries in this particular episode, but I was wondering if we could close with a little salute to General Patton, who dies on, what was the 21st? Yeah, 21st.
Yeah. I mean, I do suggest. I mean, I had never seen it before, which is The Last Day of Patton, and they depict in absolutely agonizing detail the terrible situation he was for the last, what was it, 9th, and in a plaster cast and the whole thing on his back, and that awful, and then eventually dying. They were hoping they wanted to fly him off to America, so he died in America. I mean, that was a film, and that's George C. Scott reprising the part that got him the Oscar, but for this period. And I think it's probably made to try and counter the conspiracy theories that Patton had been bumped off by conspiracy. The depiction of it was just a pathetic, ridiculous accident. Anyway, so hats off to George and his family.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I felt very sorry for his wife, because having not seen him really for so long, she has to come in. Well, at least she was at his side when he passed away. And they, by all accounts, they had a very loving relationship, and they were very, and she was a
but the film doesn't hold back. It does actually depict Patton's girlfriend, so she's there.
Yeah.
If you watch it, they don't hold back on it. I mean, he's there, and he's quite openly escorted his mistress to public events. So anyway, there you are. But he wasn't the only person who was guilty of such offences against mortal vows.
I wanted to make a last point regarding the Patton movie, which I have to say was one of, I know the tanks aren't accurate, and a lot of situations aren't accurate, and I know that basically certain scenes that you have in it are a little bit threadbare, to say the least. But I think it's an absolutely amazing film. It hits the spot on so many levels. The cinematic scope of it, they actually somehow managed to nail it. And George C. Scott's performance, together with Carl Malden, who's absolutely brilliant as Bradley. And they nailed the Anglo-American relations. I think the actor that they got to play Alexander was genius casting. We don't really know who he is, but and by the way, Freddie de Gangorn.
All right, sorry,
it's something I think that's how it's pronounced. It's a difficult one there, but anyway, that meeting and the whole portrayal of the Battle of the Bulge, or I prefer to call it the Battle of the Ardennes. I've never liked the name, the Battle of the Bulge. I think it's absolutely meaningless and very nondescript. It is the Battle of the Ardennes, or maybe the second Battle of the Ardennes in the Second World War, and that's how I refer to it. I think it's the correct term. I think it nails the geographic positioning of what happens in that battle, and I think that is the correct name for it. But in terms of the portrayal of the Battle of the Ardennes, I think other than Band of Brothers, I think the best portrayal of it in any movie is in Patton. I think the way they portray it, the way the battle scenes, particularly the most moving bit, or maybe not the moving bit, but the most thought-provoking bit is when the true story of how Patton summons an American military chaplain, I think a Methodist, to his headquarters, demanding, he's either a Methodist or an Episcopalian, and he demands a prayer for the weather. And essentially, I can bring it up if you want, and I could read it out. Shall we go for that?
Why not, Joe?
Yeah, let's see if
it's in. So
Patton's weather prayer. Let's go. Because I really like this.
I think Patton was an Episcopalian, I think.
Possibly was an Episcopalian. I wouldn't be surprised. I think that's in keeping. But anyway, I'm reading it basically. And there's actually it's available on the Friends of the National World War II Memorial. You can search it. It's called Patton's Prayer, and it's on.
When was it written or released?
It was written. It was basically written. It was, and then it was produced in published form. And the person who put the prayer together was the chief chaplain of the Third Army, James H. O'Neill, a 52-year-old O'Neill, Irish name. So we'll have to make sure he's Catholic. That's another feather in our caps, anyway. But okay. So 250,000 copies were printed in the aftermath of the writing of this prayer. So I'm going to read out the prayer for you. So it goes like this: Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee of Thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon Thee, that armed with Thy power we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish Thy justice among men and nations. Amen. And it's signed, this particular prayer card, which is on the website. It's the World War II memorialfriends.org/blog/Patton's prayer. And it's signed by Patton, and it reads G.S. Patton Jr., Lieutenant General, commanding 3rd United States Army. And the portrayal of him reading out that prayer and all the scenes that you see of Americans in battle against Germans overnight before the weather clears is probably the most thought-provoking scene that you could have in any portrayal of the Battle of the Ardennes. It's something that kind of would have stayed with me. So again, how it's portrayed in that movie, I think it's absolutely spot on, and it's absolutely brilliant. Really captures the atmosphere, captures the mood, and there's nothing better than seeing George S. Patton himself coming to the rescue, regardless of what nationality you are.
Yeah, and James O'Neill, the chaplain, was actually a Catholic priest.
Wow, very good.
On that one, James.
Yeah.
James,
I guess we are still useful for something. Yeah.
Well, we're dressed as if we are. Joe, thanks very much.
I've worn a collar in many years.
Thanks very much, Joe. I'm just going to close the show. So thanks very much.
See you next.
And that's it. Well, thank you very much. Fascinating. We focused on two topics very strongly, but they were connected. The personalities that appeared in the Battle of the Bulge. So many of them were involved in the very bitter fighting and campaigns in Italy in December 1943, just the year before. And lots of really fascinating insights from Joe. He's a never-ending source of great information about Second World War. And I was delighted that we had the opportunity to review in some detail some of the big issues associated with the Battle of the Bulge. I recommend anybody who wants to know more. World War II TV, which is Paul Woodridge's excellent channel, it's done, I think, half a dozen specialist Battle of the Bulge programs this month. And you can go to his site and download them. And I think they're extraordinarily useful. So that's it for today. We're going to be back next week for our last show of the year. We're going to give you all a break for the new year. So until then, from everybody here at This Week in the Second World War, it's goodbye. Good luck, and may God bless you all.